Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about a different material that you might find when you're assembling and painting your miniatures, and that's resin. Now some games, particularly tabletop games recently, you'll find they have resin miniatures in them. And the reason for this is normally because the costs of producing with resin are a little bit lower than they are with plastic, and that's down mostly to the tooling involved. We've all seen, or hopefully by this point, you've seen your ordinary plastic sprue or frame, and that's just got runs of plastic which have the pieces on them that you then clip them off. Now these are normally made with injection molded plastic, so it's two big steel sides to the mold that clamp together and then they pump it full of plastic. Now resin and metal miniatures, they work on a similar sort of concept where you've got two sides of a mold, but instead of being big steel dies, they're instead silicon rubber material. Now part of the reason why this is so labor intensive is because once you've got those two parts together, you go ahead, you pour your resin or your metal into there, you wait for the bubbles or you give it a centrifuge spin or something to get any of the air out of it, and then it has to be pulled apart and checked by hand. So resin can still be quite a costly from that side of things, but compared to the cost of starting up with plastic miniatures, there is a definite sort of bonus to starting with resin. This is especially true with smaller suppliers or people who are only doing like a limited run, because instead of having to lay out for one huge machine, you can do these smaller molds, and as they get old or ragged in some way, which they eventually do, you can swap them out for a new one relatively easily. It doesn't cost much to replace a mold, but always it relies on people checking what's coming out the other end. So there's a little bit of difference there between your plastic and your resin production materials. Now actually putting them together is much the same as you'd expect with plastic. They come on these long frames and you just clip them off in much the same way. You use a lot of the same tools. They are familiar. Now you might get some resin miniatures that are a single piece, but others you'll have come multi-part kits, same as you would a Space Marine or anything like that. The difference between them though is that quite often with resin miniatures you'll have sort of an oily sheen on them, and that's the mold release agent. It helps it come out of the mold once it's all finished and this resin is cured. And trying to paint over the top of that, it's not going to work, oil and water. So these things, first of all, it pays to give them a wash. Quite literally, a wash. Now, all your tools here are exactly the same as you'd use to put together a plastic miniature. The difference being, we're going to use super glue for this guy instead of polystyrene cement or plastic glue because it won't work on resin. They're not plastic. Now, this brush that I've got here, this comes from Citadel. This is, I forget what it's called. I always just call it my resin brush because it's exactly what it is. You can make one of these at home really easily. Get an old soft toothbrush and boil it for a few minutes and you'll be good to go. Okay, all you need is these bristles, and this is good for a couple of reasons. We'll get to that. So I've got myself some nice clean tissue paper, and I have prepared a bath. Now this is every bit as complex as it looks. This is literally just some cool water. And we're not going to use hot because heat, in most cases, will actually let you warp resin. When this stuff sets, applying heat to it will let you bend it around. And this can be good if you get any parts that are bent when they arrive. But for the sake of cleaning it, in it goes. I've put a few drops of cleaning detergent in there, and that's all it needs. Normally I'd leave these in there for about 10 minutes or so, and I'd do a huge bunch at once. Chuck all of my sprues in there, leave them to sit for a little bit, and then, once they come out, you are honestly, oops. Well, that's a good sign. But you see, it doesn't actually damage them. Resin's quite sturdy, despite what you might see. But you'll occasionally see these little bits which stick out from the sides. And this gets called flash. This is anywhere where the two molds meet. You will occasionally get a little bit of separation and some of that excess material flows through out of the mold and it stays stuck to the model. Luckily, it comes off like that. So that's another big bonus to having these brushes, because it makes it incredibly easy to clean up your models. And same too on these greatcoat sides. You see here, there's this little bit of excess material. Now I can't get it off so easily while it's on the sprue, but it would just be a case of, oh, I did get rid of most of it. Just brush it off. Okay, so old toothbrush or something, or get one of these. I laughed at these things when they came out, but it's actually been a really, really handy tool. So again, your mileage may vary. But once you've taken your parts, you've given them a scrub, just take them out, pop them on something clean to air dry, okay? However long it takes. So what I have today are some pieces that I've already prepared with a wash. These guys come from Anvil Miniatures, and they do a range of sort of heroic scale infantry. If you're playing Warhammer 40,000 or anything like it, these guys are in that right sort of heroic scale where they've got big heads, big hands, and they'll fit in really nicely. The Regiments line is slightly skinnier than your average guardsman, but honestly, they fit in perfectly, and if you're doing a whole army of them, you'll never notice. That's the point. Now, I have had some fun painting up these guys already. You see, they're crammed with detail, and that's one of the benefits to resin over plastic, is that they'll hold a lot more detail than a plastic piece would. So even if they are doing these small production runs, it allows for very high quality castings. So that's another reason to think about looking into some of these resin parts. A lot of companies online will offer alternatives. So again, another one of these guys, and they are, the Anvil stuff is absolutely cracking. You'll find resin miniatures from other producers. Mad Bob springs to mind, Forge World if you want to go through official workshop channels. But they are a joy to assemble, these Anvil guys. They're really well designed, and once they're painted up, they look stunning. Now I have with me here today, this fella here, he's got a little style helm and a gas mask. And you might think that with a long greatcoat, he looks kind of familiar, sort of like Games Workshop's own Death Korps of Krieg. Now this guy resembles, but is legally distinct from that, so we're going to go ahead today and I'm going to paint him up in a scheme similar to one of those Death Korps guys. So first off, when you're preparing your miniatures for assembly, okay, any stray bits of stuff that are on them, all it takes is a couple of seconds and just clip. Resin is quite soft. It's softer than plastic. All I'm going to do is go ahead and assemble them in the same way that I would any other miniature. So, little tab on his base here. I'm just going to get some super glue, just to make sure that it fits both sides. Now the difference between assembling with super glue and plastic glue, first of all, super glue sets really quickly, so you want to make sure that you're doing a test fit to everything, okay, a dry fit, because it allows you to sort of figure out your posing a little bit ahead of time and prepare for any issues that might arise. So if two pieces don't fit perfectly, better to find out before they've got super glue on them, otherwise you're buggered, okay? So, talking about dry runs, do it, it's a good idea. Now the second thing with superglue is that it will dry unlike plastic glue, and instead of evaporating, if you have a big sort of splodge over the side of any detail, it's going to dry and harden in the shape of that splodge. So you want to be kind of sparing with it. Don't put a ton on just so that stuff will stick more quickly. You want to take your time with this. So I know already, because I've done a few dry runs, how I want to assemble this guy. So I'm going to go ahead now, and just with a little dab of super glue each time, put him together how I've planned out. And then once I've finished that, we'll come back and we'll look at how to prime them, which is, once you've gone and washed off that mold release agent, exactly the same as you would a plastic model, but we'll go through the steps. Now my miniature's been assembled, and he's been base coated in just the same way that I would a plastic or a metal miniature. Quick blast of Xandri dust for this fella. Now ordinarily I might have used Mechanicus Standard Grey instead, or any old Grey's primer, but I'm out of that at the moment, so I had to improvise. And Xandri dust is going to do us quite well for the colours that we're going to use for this guy today. Now, one of these Death Korps regiments, they have a really nice green, sort of woolen effect on their uniforms. So I'm going to use Death Guard green as the base of that. I'm then going to go ahead, I'm going to do his trousers in Mechanicus standard grey, and his helmet, which will be a slightly darker green, I'll use Castellan green. Xandri Dust, I'm going to do the puttees on his legs, and I'll do his gas mask in the same material. So, hey, we've already base coated that with the spray, good job. Dryad Bark, I'm going to do the hose on his gas mask, just on the side of his face, and his gloves in the same. Steel Legion Drab, I'm going to do his boots, and all of the straps and his webbing and the pouches he's got there. Any black details, sorry, any metal details rather, will be Lead Belcher. Now, one of the things I've got lurking in the back here is Athonian Camo Shade, and that's going to be how I do his jacket. This is quite a nice, it's a very, when I say camo shade, it is Army Man green, and this is really what we want for what we've got coming up. So to start with, the largest area of colour is going to be his jacket. So let's go ahead, get that started. Now, a quick note on watering down paint. We often talk about, oh, you must thin your paints, but nobody ever really goes into any great detail about what that actually entails. So you get yourself a little bit of paint on your palette, and then just add a fraction of water. These brushes, they tend to soak up water fairly quickly. What you're looking for is slightly thicker than milk. You want a creamy sort of appearance, especially with your base coats, because you want these to go on smooth and dry smooth too, so they don't want to hold brush strokes. So you see, if I draw my brush through my paint rather, it starts flowing just back together. Okay, I won't get a complete, that brush stroke is not going to go away entirely, but you can see how the paint is flowing, and that's what I want. It's not a straight 2-to-1 mix because, different manufacturers are going to give you a different concentration of their paint. They'll need less or more water. So just bear in mind, that's a little bit of practice. Now, Death Guard green's quite a light green for a base coat, so it's probably not going to give me a perfect cover in one go. So I might end up going back and doing a second one of these. With that second coat of Death Guard green with plenty of time to dry, you see what a difference it makes to the overall colour. Okay, that's much richer, a little bit darker, but that's still quite bright for for our sort of figures. So we're going to go ahead. That Athonian Camo Shade I mentioned is going to go on now. Now this is quite a deep, it's almost like a green version of Agrax Earthshade, and we all know how much I love that. So you see how quickly this one settles. Anywhere that it pulls up too much, you can just shift it around while it's still wet. And if you get any of it on the brown areas or what have you, this doesn't really matter at this stage. We're going to paint all of those again anyway. So take your time, go around, make sure that you're getting it into all the recesses, and we're going to paint this jacket green. That wash has given us plenty of shading effect, and it's really darkened down that green a little, so that we've got a much nicer looking effect overall. Now, it's still not quite dry in some of the recesses, but I'm going to go ahead and get started painting the other details because I'm not going to interfere with that just yet. So the next largest area of detail, bearing in mind I always like to paint down, is going to be his trousers. Nice and simple, we'll get Mechanicus Standard Grey, and I'll paint that on now. Now his trousers don't take long to do, and you see I've made sure to get up underneath so that all of that detail is there. I just check the back of them as well, make sure that there's nothing I'm missing, but nope, that's done. Nice and simple. So next up, I'm going to paint all of these straps and what have you, and I'm going to use Steel Legion Drab for this. Now, if you've ever had to wear or had to maintain stiff, bloody canvas webbing, this is what you're looking for here with this colour. That grungy, awful, bloody nonsense. And there it is again, concentrating, whispering. It's a recurring theme. So let's just go around and we're going to touch in all of these details with my Steel Legion Drab here. Now with the Steel Legion Drab on all of his canvas stuff, I thought his boots might look cooler if they were this beige colour rather than a dark leather, and I think I'm going to stick with that. But next up we're going to do his helmet, just to deepen that down and make the face stand out a little bit more. If we make any mistakes there, we can tidy that up with Xandri Dust around the gas mask, but this won't take a second. So I'm going to use Castellan Green, and applied like all of the other colours so far, just a couple of thin coats over his helmet. Now that a couple of coats have been applied to that green, it's a nice solid colour. Now, what I was going to do is go ahead and tidy up any of the mask here, but I had a thought. I'm going to do a couple of little metal details on it later. So instead, I'm going to do the black on the gun and then all of the metal details, and then I'll be able to tidy that up. So again, just thinking of ways that you can save yourself a few brush strokes. So I'm going to go ahead, get my black, and for this one, I'm using Vallejo Model Colors black. I think I've mentioned before that I like how this covers a little bit more than Abaddon black or Abaddon black. But if you're using Citadel paints purely, then Abaddon black's not too bad. You just need a couple of coats to get that coverage. So as ever, exactly the same procedure. A little bit of paint, a little bit of water. And once you're satisfied with that, it's time to start jabbing that in. Now it's time for a little lead belcher. Now you might want to do buttons and things at the same time if you're going to do these in a metallic color too, but I like to leave those as a last detail because we're going to wash over all of this again and it will make them quite dark. I want them to stand out a little bit. But any metal details that we have here, I am just going to go ahead and chuck on some lead belcher. So won't take me a second to get all of these done. Now the actual mechanics of the gun, it's a future laser blim blam cannon, you can paint it however you like. Now we'll do any leather details with Dryad bark. Now I'm going to give him a leather strap for his rifle. I thought about giving him a canvas one, but I like the idea that these are a little bit more, well, let's say valued. The Imperial Guard, they don't have a huge amount of resources to waste on these sorts of things. But sometimes it's nice to imagine that they do care enough about these little things. So I'm going to do his gloves. I'm going to do this strap, and I'll do the hose on the side of his gas mask as well with this Dryad bark. And finally, any Xandri dust details. Now, because I decided that I wasn't going to do the boots in leather and I went for that brown instead, I'm going to do his puttees in Xandri dust as well, and I'll tidy up any of the mess around his face that I made just now with that Dryad bark. So Xandri dust for these cloth details. And then we're almost ready to give him his wash. With those details finished off, we're ready to give him his wash. But I did briefly want to touch on the eye lenses. Now sometimes you'll want to paint these in a certain colour, like you want to do them blue or red if you're going for more sinister. Today I'm going to do it with sort of a glossy black finish, because I think that looks a little more realistic. And colour-wise he's got quite a lot going on. I might, if I was thinking about it, do him an orange or something just to set off the face, but I'm not going to. What you would do, and one that I've used previously, like on this fella here, is just before you go to that last step and clean up the face with that Xandri dust, I'd get some white and just block in the eye sockets. They'd get washed over with everything else, but then once that's finished and everything's tidied back up, just a little bit of wash or a shade, or a glaze on the color that you want to use over the top of that slightly dirtier white will give you the finish that you're looking for, I think. It looks pretty cool and it's really easy. But I'm going to do much the same, but with black instead. So we'll see how that turns out when we come to it. First of all though, as with everything in life, we need our Agrax Earthshade. And this is going to go straight over the top of everything that we've already washed too. So the whole miniature. You want to go into all the recesses, make sure you're not missing anything. And this is standard procedure. So I'm going to finish this off, get him covered in this wash, and we'll come back and see him once he's dried. Now our wash is almost finished, and you can see what a difference it makes to the overall tone. It's darkened it down quite a bit further, and really, that's nice. Now the one last thing I'm going to do on the wash side of things is I am going to add a little black with the metal here, because at the moment it's just a wee bit brown and I want to darken it down even further so that my highlights on it are really going to stand out. With those washes applied, it's time to think about how we're going to highlight his jacket, and there's a few ways that we can go about this. Now you might notice, cheeky boy, I've still got Death Guard green on the table, and that's because we have used 2 washes over that green and we might actually get away with highlighting it with itself. Spoiler warning, we will, that's what I'm going to use. You could also use Strachan green or Elysian green. Now these two, Strachan green has got a slightly sort of green-grey finish to it, and Elysian green is more, well, it's more green, it's more cartoony. Now the two of these would work quite well, but they're not going to give us a huge amount of contrast, so those highlights aren't going to really stand out very much from across the table. Instead, I'm going to go for the brightest of them and go straight back to Death Guard green. And as you can see, it's quite close to Strachan green, but I want this one. This is going to look the best, I think. So now it's just a case of preparing your paint the same way you would. A little bit of water so that it just comes off the brush without a lot of fuss. You want it to flow without having to apply a lot of pressure. And once you're satisfied with how you've got it prepared, just bring your model up. Always check in on my fingernail. And just go around all of these edges. Take your time on this one, because this is, it's a little bit fiddly, but you'll see it makes a big difference when we're done. So I'm going to buzz around. Let's do his collar here as well. That's a good place to show that off. You notice I'm not drawing a single straight line. I'm actually sort of dabbing it on a little. And part of that is because that's easier to control. For me anyway. I've got quite twitchy hands at the best of times. So I find that just coming back to it a couple of times lets me build up the colour rather than leaving a single thick line that I might make a mistake with. So I'm going to go around, I'm going to paint all of the highlights on him, except for under his jacket here. Frankly, nobody is ever going to see it, and leaving it without that highlight will give it a bit more of a shadowy, shaded appearance. So I'll leave that there, and I'm going to finish all of these jacket highlights now. With those highlights applied, we've reintroduced a lot of depth to the jacket, and you can see, by using the original colour, we've actually managed to bring it up closer to what I had in mind in the first place, which is that slightly woolen appearance. That little bit of green-grey really does the trick there. So, now what we're going to go on to is, let's do his helmet. So with that done, I'm going to use Lauren Forest as the highlight for the helmet. And this is, again, a real easy one. All I'm going to do is use the edge of my brush rather than the tip. And I'm going to just flick around the edges of the helmet there so that the edge of my brush is catching that extreme edge of the detail. Now it looks really green going on, but this will dry down to a slightly more respectable looking tone. So just follow around all of the hard edges and pick out those little details where you want the light to really catch. We're going to use Dawnstone to lighten up his trousers. Gawthor Brown on all of the leather details. A quick highlight of Baneblade Brown across any of those canvas details. We use a little Ishabti Bone for any of those Xandri dust areas from earlier. And then just a little Stormhost Silver or Runefang Steel to do the very edges of these silver details. Then I've gone back with a little Dawnstone to finish off the edges of his gun, which I should have done at the same time as I did his trousers, and I've also used some lead belcher just to polish off his buttons, because I think those look pretty good with a little bit of metallic. Though you can leave them to match the uniform if you want sort of that plastic or wood button effect. And as you can see, that's actually really cracking. I'm really pleased with how that colour scheme's come out. He looks pretty similar to somebody from a far and distant future where there is nothing else other than war. What the last thing is those eye sockets. I'm going to use Nuln Oil, and this might take me a couple of passes to do. So, I've got myself a fine brush, not a fine detail brush, just anything that's not going to hold a huge amount of wash in one go, because I don't want to lose control of this. It will very quickly overwhelm the highlights I've done if I do. So let's get them up real close. I'll just test on my thumb how much I'm going to leave. Then let's, ooh, nervous. Just carefully paint that in. And you'll notice the wash tends to collect towards the edges of that detail. So where that ring is, it will collect naturally there. So I'm going to do that to the other eye, and then I'll give them a second coat of this. And we'll see how that looks once it's dried. So here he is, after a couple of coats of Nuln Oil in those eye sockets, and I've given him a once-over with one of the varnishes I like to use. And you can see how, especially around the eyes, it's got that, depth to it, but he still has horrible, black, soulless, slightly sinister, it fits. And with that, the miniature is actually complete. You can see around all of the details have been highlighted. He's got that lovely depth to the miniature, and, I think, he's going to look cracking on the table. Now, that is just one way that you could paint these guys. Like I said, these are totally not Krieg. The Anvil Miniatures guys, they've done some cracking work with these sculpts. And as I showed you earlier, there are, other helmets, other heads. There's a huge range which you could use to put together your own troops. If you wanted to paint them more specific to Krieg, there are other painting tutorials out there which you might get a kick out of. But these miniatures, seriously shout out to Anvil. Now, as demonstrated, painting with resin past a point is just the same as painting plastic or metal. It's really about that preparation. Just a bath beforehand to remove any of that mold release agent, and then you're good to go. So hopefully, guys, something in there was useful to you. I know that a lot of that might be old hat to some of the guys who've been doing this for a while, particularly how resin works and how miniatures are made, but, this is aimed more at people who are getting started, and to show that resin is not something to be afraid of. It's really cool, holds a lot of detail, and hey, once it's painted up, looks the business. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to base him, put him to the side so I can get a picture and show you how he looks when he's all finished. But as ever, guys, feel free to get in touch. Any comments, drop them in there down in the comments section, or you can get in touch on my Facebook or my Twitter. So, as ever, enjoy the rest of your day, guys, and thank you very much for your time.